One. Welcome to Bridging the Digital Divide in the COVID-19 era, co-sponsored by the Kansas City Public Library, the National Urban League, and the Urban League of Greater Kansas City. At the onset of the pandemic, the Urban League of Greater Kansas City established a collective impact collaborative comprised of representatives from human services, education, healthcare, transportation, workforce development, technology, and civic organizations to leverage our collective core competencies to identify and effectively respond to the needs of the vulnerable populations we serve. Early on in our journey, it became abundantly clear that the digital divide was a common thread running through every challenge associated with this pandemic, from online learning to healthcare to working from home or looking for employment and beyond. Broadband access is as much a basic household necessity as water, gas, and electricity. It is the hope of our collective impact collaborative, including the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Black Healthcare Coalition, Civic Council, Kansas City Public Library, Hush Blackwell, Goodwill, PCs for People, Greater Kansas City LISC, School Smart KC, Kansas City Kansas City Public Schools, Lean Lab, and the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, that today's conversation will shed more light on the problem inform national and local policy decisions, and promote local digital equity initiatives as we work toward our goal of 100% household connectivity. So I'd like to get started by introducing our stellar panel. We have joining us this morning, Geoffrey Starks, Commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, Quinton Lucas, Mayor, City of Kansas City, Missouri, Councilwoman Melissa Robinson, 3rd District City Council Representative and President of the Black Healthcare Coalition, Dr. Mark Bedell, Superintendent, Kansas City Public Schools, and Dr. Marshall Stewart, Vice Chancellor and Chief Engagement Officer of University of Missouri, and Carrie Coogan, Deputy Director of the Kansas City Public Library. Co-moderating with me this morning is my esteemed colleague from the National Urban League, Clint Odom, Senior VP for Policy and Executive Director of the National Urban League Washington Bureau. We will kick off our conversation with a special video message from Congressman James Clyburn, Majority Whip of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Let me thank you in the Urban League movement, especially there in Kansas City, for the attention you've given to what I consider to be one of the most important issues of the 21st century. Let me share with you a little testimony that I often share with people when I'm talking about broadband. When the co-ops, the rural electric co-ops, were celebrating their 50th anniversary providing electricity to rural communities, they wrote and had published a tabletop book that was entitled The Next Generation. The reason that book was called that is because a farmer standing in a rural Tennessee church one evening said this: "Brothers and sisters, I want to tell you this. The greatest thing on earth is to have the love of God in your heart. And the next greatest thing is to have electricity in your house." Now, that may have been the next greatest thing for the 20th century. I believe that. But I also believe that the next greatest thing for the 21st century is to have broadband in every home. We are not going to be able to effectively have health care in rural communities without broadband. We're not going to be able to adequately educate our children, especially in rural communities, without online learning. Broadband, to me, must be the number one infrastructure issue as we relaunch the 21st century. We are going to have a relaunching of the 21st century. COVID-19 will dictate that. This is a virus that I'm told will be with us for a while. And the only way that we can do the testing, the contact tracing, the isolating, and the treating is to have digital involvement in that effort. So thank you all so much for focusing on this issue. I hope that we can soon, throughout this country, commit ourselves to making broadband just as prevalent as we made electricity 50 years ago. Thank you.
Clint, turn it over to you.
Well, that was a powerful opening, and we'll have an equally powerful rejoinder or follow-up from FCC Commissioner Geoffrey Starks. Commissioner, it's good to see you in another venue. You and I may be in the same census tract right now, but we are back in your hometown talking to your folks about an issue that's very important to you and very important to the Urban League movement. So thank you for being here. Commissioner, you appreciate, as a native son of Kansas City, the dichotomy in this region of urban and rural, wealthy and low income, black and white. A research group has recently released a new white paper arguing that the current federal policies, which limit broadband funding to rural infrastructure deployment while offering no help to millions of unconnected urban residents, is, quote, structurally racist, discriminating against unconnected Black Americans and other communities of color. In the rural counties, which are most likely to qualify for federal broadband funding, people living in households with no broadband, the intended beneficiaries of the government's efforts to close the digital divide, are mostly white alone and non-Hispanic, according to the American Community Survey data. And at the Commission, you and your colleagues have really been working hard on rural broadband issues, most recently announcing a $20.4 billion Rural Opportunity Fund. And Congress did its part by appropriating about $325 million in the CARES Act to address a variety of rural connectivity issues. But in urban areas like Kansas City, the majority of people living in households with no broadband are the people in the largest cities and the least rural counties. The places least likely to qualify for broadband infrastructure funding or even adequate broadband subsidies are non-white, multiracial, and or Latinx or Hispanic. So a recent study by the Kansas City Library and the Schools, Health, and Libraries Coalition shows that parts of Kansas City with the highest levels of poverty have the lowest rate of internet adoption. And overall, despite impressive gains that the city has made over the past few years, Kansas City still lags behind the national internet adoption rates. So here's my question for you, Commissioner. Does Kansas City have a broadband adoption problem, a broadband access problem, or a broadband affordability problem? And how are lawmakers and policymakers in Washington pivoting to address what you have described as the COVID divide?
Well, thank you so much for the question. It is so good to be here. Thank you for hosting the event, Urban League. So good to see so many friends, Gwen, Clint, of course, Carrie. Thank you to the opener by Mr. Clyburn. For those who don't know, it's his 80th birthday here today. And he's been a powerful leader on so many fronts, including broadband. And I, of course, am honored, deeply honored to be in a conversation with the mayor. And so I don't know whether to call you Mayor Q, my mayor, Mr. Mayor. And so I'll do what's most natural and just say my friend. For a lot of folks, I'm going to start with the narrative here. My path to the FCC started in Kansas City on the issue of the digital divide. 10 years ago, when I was clerking in Kansas City for a federal judge there, the Honorable Dwayne Benton, I went to get my haircut at a black barbershop on Paseo, which I understand was MLK Boulevard, which is now back to Paseo. And I sat down in the chair and was getting my haircut, and we started debating sports. And I know we were debating the Kansas City Chiefs in particular, because for anyone who's had an argument about sports, a lot of folks have their own opinions, but not everyone shares the same facts. And so I started to get up from the chair. I remember it just like it happened yesterday. And I said, let's all go home and look it up. And then when I come back and get another haircut, we'll see who's right and who's wrong. And the barbershop got really quiet, and everybody really started thinking, what do you mean go home and look it up? And I said, let's all go home, look it up on the internet. And this whole black barbershop was baffled. And it became very crystal clear to me that we were talking 10 years ago even about a community that was not connected. And what makes that so real even today is that Kansas City is such a microcosm of all the issues that you talked about in your question there, Clint. And what was true 10 years ago is true today. Communities of color, Black and Hispanic households are significantly less likely than their counterparts to have internet at home. And that was the thrust of the NDIA white paper that you mentioned as well. And so over time, we see the same communities and the same folks getting left behind. We need a change. Broadband is powering our economy. It is promoting safe, distant practice of medical care. And it is an essential tool for our students in distance learning and helping to educate them. The COVID-19 pandemic has magnified and widened many inequities that we see in public health. I have followed with some true dispiriting in my heart that there in Kansas City, over 50% of the people testing positive for COVID-19 are Black. We see this across urban communities, that communities of color, in particular Latinx and Black households, are bearing the brunt, a disproportionate amount of losses. And that is true as well with regard to the digital divide, or what I've called the internet inequality. And that is focusing on the moral component we need now to make sure that all Americans are connected. The disparities in millions of Americans that have faced shelter-in-place orders, and so many families that I see that are relying on parking lots and restaurants in order to get that Wi-Fi connection. And so to your point, to the question, this is a multi-variable issue that is complex. Yes, yes, and yes. We have an access issue, no doubt, there in Kansas City, making sure that folks have the availability of high quality, affordable broadband. And now rural broadband is important. It is something that I think of truly. And when I last visited Kansas City in my first visit as a commissioner, I went with Congressman Cleaver out to Blue Springs, and we focused on some of the rural issues that we saw there. But nearly 3 times as many Americans don't have connections in urban spaces than live in rural spaces. And so we've got to focus on the access in densely populated areas as well. Adoption and digital literacy are also a key component here. In particular, when we're talking about so many senior Americans right now who find themselves isolated. They're going to need it for telemedicine, for telehealth. But the fact of the matter is that some of our seniors are the most disconnected and don't know how to get onto the internet and to do it safely. And the other component, of course, is making sure that Americans have access to devices. You can have all the connectivity in the world, but if our youngest learners don't have a laptop, don't have an iPad that they can use, then they're not able to get connected in the ways that we need them to. And so that's where the federal government and the FCC in particular can step in and make a difference. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have made some good strides. More than 700 carriers signed the Keep America Connected pledge, agreeing not to disconnect customers and consumers who can't pay their bills, of course, during this crisis. We set up the $200 million COVID-19 telehealth program. And in fact, I'm happy to announce that, back on June 10th, the FCC awarded Kansas City's Care Clinic in Kansas City, Missouri, almost above $90,000 for computers, monitors, and telehealth software licenses to continue to upgrade its telehealth equipment to increase remote patient visits. I also talked about the need for us opening up some unused spectrum, but there's more work to do. And I have called from the very start of this pandemic for a connectivity stimulus. We have stimuli in so many other areas in public health to help connect, to help businesses, to help Americans through this. We need a connectivity stimulus. It is impacting every aspect of our life. And so we need to focus on Lifeline, an FCC program specifically designed for the low income. Only about 20% of Americans that are eligible for it actually subscribe, 7.5 million out of 38 million households that are eligible. And so one of the things that I've called for is for the federal government to ensure that when families sign up for SNAP, if you are having food insecurity, you're likely also having digital insecurity as well. And so making sure that Americans don't have to ask for help and knock at each door. If they are asking for help from SNAP, the likelihood that they need to be connected to the Lifeline program, a federal program, like I said, designed for the low income, is likely, and we've got to better connect them. The government cannot work in silos right now. The second thing I would focus on is FCC's E-rate has got to do more and to meet the moment. Obviously, as I'm sure we'll hear today, K through 12 students and many of our universities are trying to figure out what the fall is going to look like. And I know that the mayor even spoke about this morning. And so making sure that if folks are going fully digital, fully virtual, or whether they are having some type of hybrid option that a lot of schools and school districts are considering, we've got to make sure that our students have what they need to continue to lead and make sure that they are the next generation. That includes E-rate offering hotspots, devices for school-age children. I've called for this and it's got to happen. The last real piece that I would talk about here is the need for FCC and Congress to work together to come up with an affordable broadband service. Over 18 million Americans don't have the internet solely because it's too expensive. We have over 50 million Americans that are out of work, applying for unemployment insurance, and they shouldn't have to choose between groceries and the internet. We need to present them with an affordable option, $10, $11, $12 for them to be able to get connected to the internet. There's legislation that is pending right now, and we need to make sure that we continue to agitate for it. And let me close here. I recently published an op-ed in Essence with leaders in our community, including, of course, National Urban League CEO Mark Morial, the Reverend Al Sharpton, Vanita Gupta, Marita Kohli, focusing on the fact that broadband is an essential civil right. And so let me close for sure with this. One of my personal heroes and the late Congressman John Lewis said, and I quote, "Access to the internet is the civil rights issue of the 21st century," close quote. I agree.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Those remarks are right on time. I want to pivot now, if I can, to my friend Marshall Stewart. Marshall, of course, you play a leading role in coordinating a statewide coalition focused on rural broadband access. So I'll ask you the same question that I asked Commissioner Starks. Does rural America have a broadband adoption problem, an access problem, or an affordability problem? And do you agree with Congressman Clyburn that we need to treat broadband in the 21st century the way we treated electrification in the 20th?
Well, thank you, Clint. And I tell you, after hearing the commissioner speak, I think we could probably end this because I think he's laid out the case pretty well today. It's a real joy for me to be with you from the University of Missouri. Just to set context, I work in the area of extension, engagement, and outreach for the University of Missouri system. So I do a lot of work with UMKC, actually, one of your great universities there. Had the opportunity to work across the entire state to 114 counties and really have that whole presence. Our job in essence is to basically bring knowledge from the university to the people of the state. So when I talk about my student body, I talk about 6 million Missourians. That's really what I focus on every day. The area that we've talking about today is broadband, obviously, and it's really critical. When I got here a little over 4 years ago, I began this work in Missouri. My native home of North Carolina is where I'm from, an NC State guy, but I got here and really saw the depth of the challenge here in Missouri. And I think it's already been articulated by the congressman and by the commissioner that this is not just a rural issue. This is an America issue. This is an issue that goes far beyond a divide. And what we need to start talking about is how do we deal with this nationally? How do we deal with this across the state? How do we deal with this at every level of government? Because it's going to take all of us. I think the congressman laid out a great case when he talked about, and these would be my words, the way I would say it, it's a utility. When we talk about broadband, it needs to be considered just like electricity. For people in this country, if we don't figure out a deal with this, we're going to continue to see people, regardless of where they live, rural or urban, left behind. And that is not something that's an American value. That is not something we have built on in this country. And we need to figure that out, because it really brings access to economic development. It brings access to education. It brings access to healthcare in ways that we know that should be. And we've seen that in COVID-19, in particular in the area of healthcare. The University of Missouri, for instance, here in Columbia, has done more telehealth. We've seen telehealth take off. But the problem is, if you don't have broadband access, you can't get access to that. We've got an initiative here where we're working really closely with our Department of Psychology here at Mizzou on rural mental health, for instance. And we've got that on a phone now, where you can actually go onto your phone with an app and have access to mental health, which is a phenomenal thing. But again, broadband access, coverage is so critical in those things. There's so much more we can do from the university, from other public sector entities, if we can get this access to the people of the state, of our communities that need it so badly. So let me go back to the questions you asked about, is it an access issue? Is it an affordability issue? Is it an issue that really deals with an adoption issue? And I'm going to say just what the commissioner said. Yes, yes, and yes. It's all three. And I think we're all going to agree with that. But I do think when you take those three things and you look at them today, the bottom line is there's just a lot of areas that don't have good coverage. One of the things that we're challenged with, and I know our colleague like the commissioner deals with this, is a lot of times if you look at maps, it shows that maybe it has been put in a particular community, but if you can't tap into that or afford to tap into it, it might as well not be there. And so I had someone actually in my office at Mizzou actually tell me just yesterday that she found out that the fiber was put across from her house 5 years ago. She didn't even know it. And suddenly somebody shows up at her house and says, we want to connect you, because they figured out how to fund it now. But for 5 years, she's gone without. I think you would find that over and over and over in this country, much less this state or the community that you represent in Kansas City. And we can do better than that. We've got to do better than that. So what we've done is taken this platform of extension, engagement, and outreach, and we've used it as a platform. We've been in editorials. We've been interviewed all over the country. We've said, look, if we're not in the business here at the university of putting down fiber. We are in the business of public good, of public service, of being a rallying cry for people to say, hey, somebody is listening, somebody does care. So, when I think about this issue, I think it's going to take all of us. It's a collective of all of us working together. One thing that I remember, one of the trips I made when I first got here was to the other side of the state from where you sit today in Kansas City to St. Louis. And I remember I was talking about the broadband issue. And I had some friends that I had made there in St. Louis County who said, whoa, this is not about rural. This is me. I've got this problem. And so when I went over to Kansas City, I found the same thing. And I was like, okay, we've got to frame this thing. Yes, we're very concerned about the rural issues, and we're going to continue to. It is a problem, but it's bigger than that. And I think we're bigger than that as people, and that we in the university are really excited. Let me share with you just a couple things as I close out my remarks about things that we're doing. We've been a rallying cry champion, but we've also created something that I think the viewers today will be really interested in, called the mobroadband.org site. I would encourage you to go to that. It just got released last week. What we've done is taken all the intellectual capacity of the university, researchers working in this space from all different perspectives. If you go to that resource rail, is what we call it, mobroadband.org, you're going to find all kinds of ways that community leaders can find grants, can find opportunities of how to partner with carriers, because it's going to take people on the ground level working in communities to make this happen, be it rural or urban. We've all got to do our part, but this is a resource rail, a tool, and we're constantly updating it now. We think it's something that can be very useful. We've gotten a lot of good feedback on it in just the last 4 or 5 days. Again, it's cutting edge, easy to use, easy to tap into, and it's something that we think is really important. We've also taken, as I've mentioned earlier, we've got a group here across the state that I work with regularly of leaders. We helped establish a few years ago with some other leaders the state broadband office, for instance, in Missouri. That did not exist until just a few years ago. And they're doing great work in Kansas City and other places, Tim Arbeiter and that team. So we're working with them. We've also got a community of thought leaders here in the university across all 4 university campuses from UMSL, UMKC, Missouri S&T, and Mizzou, working collectively, trying to figure out what new technologies, what new research can we deploy in community that can make a difference. It's going to take all of that. It's not one solution, it's all of that. So again, I'm really excited to be a part of this. I want to thank you for the opportunity. We at the University of Missouri stand ready to help and to partner. We, again, see ourselves as a champion of it. We know that we can't, bottom line, we can't extend knowledge into communities, be it formal or non-formal education, be it degree bearing or credentials. We can't do our job if we don't have it. We can't deploy healthcare if we don't have it, if those communities don't have it. So it is, yes, there's self-interest, but it's bigger than that. It's about the best interest of all Americans. So again, we're glad to be with you, Clint. Look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Marshall. I'll turn it over to you, Gwen.
Thank you, Clint. So we have a time management issue here. We're late started, so we're going to have to make up the time starting now. I'd like to alert the audience that we will be taking questions. We hope to have enough time for questions, so please go ahead and post your questions in the chat on YouTube, and we will do our best to get them. So now I hope you can succinctly answer the questions so we can make up some time. On March 9th, 2017, the City of Kansas City adopted the Digital Equity Plan, spreading a path from digital inclusion to economic mobility and entrepreneurship as its thing. So this path includes the traditional 3-legged stool of digital inclusion, activity, computing device, and digital life skills training. So last month, the City Council passed a resolution directing the city manager to develop and implement private public partnerships to effectuate digital equity for residents, students, and small business in Kansas City. So how has the pandemic and the associated revenue losses affected the implementation of the plan, and how exactly the strategic plan closed broadband gaps exposed by the COVID pandemic? And 30 seconds. Just kidding.
I think I may jump in on that one, if that's okay. And it's good to be with everybody today. And particularly, I love seeing everybody. My old friend, Geoffrey Starks, who was this sharp brother from Kansas City, who would go far, and now basically he's running the country. So, we're very proud of you and still proud of you back here and back home. A few things that I wanted to say in connection with our digital equity plan. Ms. Grant certainly noted the priorities that we had, both when it was passed by council in 2017 and as we've looked at it year after year. But the question you asked, Ms. Grant, relates to the problem that we have with most of our equity issues. Where's the money, right? Where is actually the long-term sustained support in it? So back in 2017, we all actually were excited, had press events about our ability and desire to close the digital divide. Had we actually funded it back then when we had a stronger economy, then come the 2020 COVID-19 challenge, we might be in a different place. I just gave a press conference about schools and reopening and virtual classrooms, et cetera. It's something that I know I've talked to Superintendent Bedell about and a number of other superintendents in our community. And the problem was we, and I say we as the city, weren't ready. And I think it would be fair to say that we are not ready now. Our next step is how do we fix it and how do we address it? step one, I think, is working with a number of those organizations that are always interested in kind of giving us some support, right? Many of you may have, even in your own lives, heard a lot of people saying, since protests started a few months ago, what can we do? What can my company do to help? Well, I think when you talk about how we can create and enhance connectivity, you have a very good example. We have a number of different providers in our region, both Google, AT&T, Spectrum, et cetera. But what we need to do with those providers is even more work to make sure that we're encouraging them and incentivizing them to make sure our homes are connected. And frankly, if we rolled out our Prospect Max bus line, created, I think, better citywide Wi-Fi accessibility that you have seen in some slightly more ambitious American cities. It would be my goal that we actually, as we're looking to receive more federal dollars, get more investment that helps in those key areas. Another key step is how do we actually make sure that we have training and connection with digital literacy. The public library is already actually doing an outstanding job. I would love to see us provide even more support for them in their areas, where each summer, each school year, they're working to make sure not just young people, but importantly, their parents, their grandparents, and so many others are trained on not just how to get on a computer, how to have a relationship with tech in some way, but also to use it to advance and enhance your economic workforce skills. Those are things that I think we're committed to. But what does the pandemic mean to us? It does mean that we're in a time of budget cuts, so it means that we actually need to make sure our priorities are seen. One area where I think we can have our priorities felt even further is the CARES Act dollars can be used to enhance our digital literacy network. We need to make sure we're doing that, particularly as we're talking about getting schools open again. I know in Washington, there continues to be conversations on stimulus, I guess it'd be stimulus 3 or 4, but we need to see something like that passed in the Congress and signed by the president. And I think ultimately we need to make sure that while we have this moment, we're reassessing households, business, schools, that we address the issues long-term, get funding where it needs for connectivity.
So we're going to shift now to Dr. Bedell. So when KCPS closed for in-person instruction in March, some 45% of students dropped off from participating in remote learning. Statewide, the estimate is that 25% of Missouri students weren't able to log into online learning this spring because of connectivity issues. And low-income families are the least likely to have adequate internet access for virtual learning. So I had several other things I wanted to say to you or questions I wanted to add, but I'm just going to jump to where we are today. The mayor just recently held a press conference making recommendations about the start of school, pushing the start of school back to September. Can you hear me okay? Okay, he's pushing the start of school back to, after Labor Day. So what plans do you have in place to mitigate for the fact that, some only 45% of the students actually showed up in virtual classrooms? How are you going to adjust for that as you look to releasing your plan for reopening KCPS schools going forward?
Thank you, Gwen, and I want to thank all of the panelists who are here today. It was a very difficult startup for us at the end of March. A couple of things that we realized was that the internet disparities were abound as far as the students that we serve inside of our boundaries. We also realized as a school district that our online curriculum for distant learning was not fully developed. We had aspects of it, but had to build that as we were in the air. We also realized that professional development, some of our teachers had taken full advantage of our digital learning platform around professional development and some didn't. And that ultimately required that during the period, all of our teachers needed to engage in that professional development to earn their badges so that they could be more engaging and more interactive with our students. We also realized that although we said that we were a one-to-one school district, we weren't because we weren't able to give out one laptop or one device to every single student. And part of the reason too was that with our K through 2 students, we had Apple iPads. We were afraid to release those just simply because I was concerned about them breaking easily, a lot easier to break than the actual laptops. And so the district's made a commitment that we cannot be an organization that will commit any further harm to students. And I think that we did our share as educational leaders, not necessarily having and being prepared for a pandemic disaster like this. And so what we said was that we took our CARES Act money and we purchased enough devices and enough hotspots for all of our families that need it. We will truly be a one-to-one school district when school resumes, even if it means releasing those Apple iPads, which we will do. We have 7,500 additional laptops on order that we're waiting to get in, hopefully by the first or second week of September. Our teachers have undertaken the professional development. This is our model where they have gone through each of these digital learning roadmap paths that will allow for them to interface with the digital platform at a higher level. We've also conducted our training for principals and administrators this summer with the Institute. Everything was focused on a distant learning, virtual learning, and also in person. So we feel good about that. When we think about where we are right now as a district, educational access channels, we have been able to secure several channels, and some of them are public channels where we'll be able to upload educational content. So for our families that need to be able to see lessons and see what's happening with the school district, that will be available. We entered into some MOUs with some radio stations so we can provide counseling related services and things of that nature from our student support division. The school district is looking at a soft launch with the Hot Channel 38 with some of our content here in the very near future. And then the most important piece is our student supports division will be working directly with schools so that when students aren't logging on within that 7-day period, we will be able to make contact. We made contact with 95% of our students, but the issue was that when you don't have everybody on one laptop and you're telling a family for every 3 kids, you get 1 laptop, you know, part of this was the creation of the school district, and that's on me as superintendent to ensure that we have 100% of these devices and hotspots available for our students. So we've learned a lot over this timeline that will allow for us to feel like we're moving into this in a more comfortable manner. My biggest concern is that hotspots only really allow for students to access the curriculum online when it's time for them to do meetings like this, or when it's time for them to do presentations. Is very spotty. That is the reason why we really have to advocate for broadband connectivity. And I think that we have to continue to push that from a policy standpoint if we really want to try to level the playing field for children that reside within the boundaries of this school district and even our rural counterparts.
Thank you for that. And I think it's really important people to understand the challenges we have with connectivity in urban districts. And so this is a hotspot, a mobile hotspot, and many families cannot afford the data fees for hotspots. But there's also the reality that there is no such thing as unlimited data on a mobile hotspot. They all have a cap on the data that's available on a monthly basis. So if you sit in a Zoom meeting or 2, or if you're in a virtual classroom for several hours, you in one day could expend all of your data. So 100% connectivity in homes is extremely important. So I'm going to shift now to Councilwoman Melissa Robinson. So you represent the 3rd Council District, where I live, an economically distressed area that is predominantly Black. Blacks in Kansas City's 3rd and 5th Council districts have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. So with the spread of the virus on the rise in Kansas City, what is the data showing today? And to what do you attribute these ongoing disparities? What percentage of your constituents have access to telehealth care services? And we've heard this conversation earlier from Commissioner Starks about the need for more access to telehealth. So can you shed some light on these issues for us, please?
Absolutely, and thank you. And so
The most recent data shows that per 100,000 residents in the city of Kansas City, the 3rd district has 1,114 individuals in terms of cases of COVID. That's sometimes 4 times more than other council districts. When you look at the 5th district, it's 281, the 1st district, 312, the 2nd district, 385. So there is a huge disparity as it relates to how COVID is showing up. But there's a huge disparity as it relates to the collateral damage of COVID that's having and wreaking havoc on the 3rd district community. And so we have to start thinking about, again, what are the things that attribute to the health disparities that we're faced with because of the cases. And that all goes back to not only historical and structural and systemic racism, but the current discriminatory practices that are happening in Kansas City, in which we're creating this dichotomy in the tale of 2 cities. And so how are we as a federal government, as a state government, a city government, a county government, how are we investing in schools in the communities that are most impacted? How are we seeing economic development play out? How are we making sure that we apply resources from an equitable lens is so critical. And this is, quite disturbing when you think about Google Fiber had its start here, right here in Kansas City. And what was the true community benefit as it relates to how fiber was developed? And was that community benefit, did it go deep enough? And so from a city council standpoint, we have to start thinking about alignment with our resources when we think about we're getting ready to approve some CDBG dollars. How far does those CDBG dollars go in addressing the inequities as it relates to the digital divide? And we have to start, when we think about economic development incentives, the community benefit has to be as deep as the benefit to the corporation that we're giving those incentives to. And they have to help us to solve the problems that we're faced with pervasively. And so as a city, we have to, again, just change our thinking and recognizing, not only do we have the courage to right these wrongs, but do we have the conviction to do the right thing? And there's many opportunities for us to do that. And when you talk about telehealth services from the Black Healthcare Coalition standpoint, yes, telehealth services are available, but there is an access issue as it relates to the digital divide. And we know the African-American community is already medically averse. And so if I couldn't get individuals to go for their preventive health screenings before COVID, it becomes an increasing challenge for us to be able to make sure people's diabetes is in check, their hypertension is taken care of. And so that there's a lot of collateral damage that we're faced with, and we have to think deeply about how are we addressing the social determinants of health? How are we addressing the economic deprivation that is so real and palatable in the 3rd district? And we have to start to intervene there sooner rather than later. So thank you, Councilwoman. So as I turn this back over to Clint, Carrie, if we run 5 minutes over, will that be a problem? Because we do want to make sure that we do want to try to have an opportunity to take a few questions from the audience.
Back when we do have a lot of audience questions already coming in. So yes, we can go a little bit over because I think it's important to take the question.
I do too. And so audience, please forgive us for our tardiness today, but this is a very important topic. And so if you have to jump off, we understand. So let me turn it over now to Clint.
Great. Carrie, we've heard today from our representatives in Washington, D.C., at the state level and the municipal level. Now we'd like to hear from you as representing the not-for-profit sector. In your role as chair of the Kansas City's Digital Inclusion Network, you've got a panoramic view of local and national efforts to achieve digital equity. Can you please talk about Kansas City's local achievements and what's on the drawing board as you work toward the goal of achieving 100% household connectivity?
Well, thank you, Clint, and thanks again to all the panelists and people who are listening in for participating in all of this, because I think it is going to take all of us to address this problem. And I think Kansas City is really well known nationally for the work that we've been doing. We're one of the first cities in the country to have a digital inclusion coalition. The fact that Google Fiber came to town really inspired a lot of people to figure out the best way to make sure that there was equitable access for everyone. And we soon found out, as Councilwoman Robinson just said, that it was not equitable for all people. And so I think we're still trying to find ways to make sure that we do that. I just want to make the point, though, that we have been working as a coalition on these issues for the past 7 years. And it has been extremely difficult to get the kind of engagement that we have. And as bad as it's been for COVID, the one silver lining is that it has really exposed just how desperately this issue needs to be addressed. It's a critical need for everybody in our community. And we've all talked about specific areas, but you're talking about Dr. Bedell's students across the community. But what about their parents? It's great if a student has a device, but do their parents have a device? And how can you run 2 computers in one household? Same thing with students. What about our immigrants? We have a huge immigrant population in Kansas City, and they have been completely left out in this area and making sure that they have access. Our senior citizens mentioned, their health depends on being able to have telehealth access right now. So I would say across the board that supporting, the key areas that I think we need desperately are continue to support libraries. I can't begin to tell you the frustration that libraries have felt when we've had to close our doors during this time, because you see the total impact of everybody who is left out. So our options have been open up our parking lots for 24-hour Wi-Fi access. That is not an option in going forward and how we are going to be successful in this city, in this state, or in this country. So we have to act and do more to help support libraries, nonprofits, even churches who can bring people in and help them get access. When you think about what people are going to be needing right now, they need help with jobs, they need help with education, they need help filing for unemployment, they need help getting back on getting their rent or finding a new home. They're all the entrepreneurs we work so hard to get in Kansas City and across the nation. Those businesses are closing, and who knows if we'll ever get them back again. And so I guess I just would implore this group and everybody on this call that we have to continue to work together, and now is the time to act. And we need a home broadband benefit, whether it's a federal one from our friend Commissioner Starks, some federal broadband benefit, or even if we can consider a local state broadband benefit. I know that there's a lot of COVID dollars out there and a lot of money from the CARES Act, but we have to galvanize and create an action plan and come up with real answers to how we can fix the problem, not just in the 3rd and 5th district, although that is where we should start, but at the entire community and the entire state and across the nation. So I guess I would just say that our achievements are great in Kansas City, but we have so much more to do.
Okay, so thank you, Carrie. We're ready for, were you able to hear her, Clint? Could you hear us? Okay, so we're ready for Q&A.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, I can take this. It looks like the first one is, how do we convince the federal and state government to fund internet subscriptions for low-income residents rather than paying internet service providers to build rural broadband? I think this touches on the question that we had at the top for Commissioner Starks and Mr. Marshall as well. I would open that up to either of you gentlemen or anyone else on the panel, but why don't we start there?
Yeah, I'll take a quick take on it, and it did touch on my comments. As you heard from a lot of leadership, including Congressman and our whip, Jim Clyburn, that rural broadband access is critically important. But when you look at the numbers and you look at the population and where people actually are, we do need to do a much better job. And it's something that I have specifically started to focus on during my commissionership, is on the nearly 3 times as many folks that are in urban areas that remain disconnected. And so focusing on an affordable option, I think, is going to be important, making sure that digital relevancy and digital literacy, as people talk about it, is going to be really important. Again, there is a large swath of seniors that really, frankly think I've lived 70 plus years on this good earth and haven't needed the internet so far. But I think that that's really becoming a much harder thing to accomplish in particular, given the isolation that is going to come if you're not able to digitally connect to folks. And then again, I think focusing on an affordable option through legislation is going to be critically important.
Great. Marshall, would you like to jump in here? Is there an opportunity for rural areas and urban areas, as we see in the greater Kansas City area, to be advocates for each other and work both on these access and affordability and adoption issues?
And I'm glad you brought that up, Clint, because it's the only way we're going to get it done. I know the commissioner would agree with this. All money is green. And if you're going to get money, you got to build coalitions that cut across urban, rural, small, large cities, municipalities, counties. Everybody has to work together on this. And that's one of the things that I have really come to grips with in this role, is that, although I spend a lot of my time working on this rural issue, it's bigger than that. And rural will never get what they really want if you don't bring urban to the table, and vice versa. It's all of that working together. It's all that coming together. And that's not always easy because people, have their own backyard that they're thinking about, but it's all of our collective neighborhood. It's the neighborhood, the communities we all work with that we have to think about. So I think if we could build coalitions, obviously it begins locally with working with providers, with working with local leadership like Ms. Robinson and others that do those local things. But then you got to bubble that up to the state level. Certainly, Kansas City is a major metropolitan area, has a lot of legislative power. If you look at it collectively, working together. And one of the things I find about this issue too is you find that it doesn't cut along political lines very much. It's really one thing you'll find right and left, middle of the road politically. Everybody sees a need for this. Now, how they may want to go about it may be different, but they all see the target. So I think there's some real opportunity in that. And again, I'm excited to hear the commissioner talk about, I hadn't met him before, but I'm really glad to know we got a friend from Missouri and Kansas City in such a high level place. I didn't know I had somebody running the country up there. That's pretty strong there, I tell you. But it's really
that's a promotion. I don't know.
I got that. But I just think it's going to be all of us working together. And there was a question there about UMKC as well. UMKC is very committed to this. Molly Agrawal, the chancellor there, and if there's ways, I'll follow up independently if people have questions on that, about how we may partner with that university to help in some ways around this too. They've been a really good partner across the system, looking at the whole state. So I know they're very concerned about it, certainly in the Kansas City metro area.
Great.
I would just add really quickly about UMKC. They have what's called the Missouri Broadband Resource Navigator, which is where where they're continually collecting all of the resources across the entire state. So we mentioned it earlier, but it's on the website, missouribroadband.org.
Yep. And they've been the leader in that. That's an important part that Carrie brings out. The leadership for that, I tap folks over at UMKC to lead that for the whole state. And so they've been so mobroadband.org is where you go now. It's a resource rail, wonderful tool that helps, again, communities take ownership of this and work together to make something happen.
Okay, we have several questions, so I'm going to ask you to try to shorten your answers so we can get to them. Next, I'm going to jump in here for one of them, Clint, and I'll turn it back over to you. But I see a question here about the census and, the concerns about the census between the lack of access and the pandemic. It could affect online responses, and federal funding is at stake. So Mayor Lucas or Councilwoman Robinson, could you speak to the challenges that we are experiencing right now with underreporting, especially in our 3rd and 5th districts, the communities with the greatest need? And do you believe that the digital divide is playing a role in this underreporting? And what strategies are in place for us to close these gaps? If we don't get back to even 2010 levels, we're going to lose revenue. It certainly impacted our CARES funding because our numbers showed up under 500, under $500,000. Therefore, that money went to the county. This is a major problem. How are you guys going to solve it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first things first, very broadly, we need to make sure we're getting more attention out to people filling out the census and dealing with the issues. Unfortunately, and I've learned this painfully well over the last probably 4 months, people are interested in news stories that have conflict right? And where there's all this tension. People aren't as interested in a news story where you just say, hey, there's no dispute. We've been doing the census since, Jesus was around. And nevertheless, let's just go ahead, fill it out, get it done, and all of that. So trying to mobilize public energy around it is important. I think, Ms. Grant, you hit a few of the issues that help us sell it, which is, for example, funding to address COVID, right? We are seeing our ability to respond being restrained by how we were a few thousand people short. I mean, it is wild. But that is tens of millions of dollars that could be helping our community right now. Millions of dollars that could be helping the Kansas City Public Schools District, right? Those sorts of things. What are we doing to change that point? One is, besides the messaging, making sure that we're trying to hit more different media sources. That includes radio stations of different types, urban contemporary stations, Spanish radio stations, that sort of thing, but also in how we're actually doing our digital outreach, advertising spots and that sort of thing to make sure you're hitting people. When we talk about how you get to digital inclusion and literacy, a lot of things aren't just in classic programs that help you on the job each day. There are a lot of app-based ways to reach people. Our health department tries to reach people through app. We're trying to make sure we're expanding that in connection with it now. Ultimately, I think we probably will have to do another big, in April, we were supposed to do a census kickoff. That was going to be April 1st. Everything got shut down around that time. We tried to kind of get the gang, happening again about a week ago. I think we probably need to do another one of those again in the fall, both because we'll have census workers on the ground, but also just to try to see what we can do to use our digital resources to find it. Another thing that I think we need to do, and then I'll get out of the way for Councilwoman Robinson, is that we recognize that how you message with people has to come in a lot of different ways. So I mentioned apps. During political campaigns, we do robocalls. We wouldn't necessarily do that, but trying to find ways through email, through every source possible, to try to actually get people where they are. And that's one thing that we need to do. Recognize that not everybody is, I say this to my staff all the time, then I'll get out of the way. They'll always schedule interviews for me on our national public radio station. And I said, I don't need the NPR crowd to know what's going on right now, right? Usually they're catching on. Right, we need to make sure we're hitting a lot of different crowds, and I think, frankly, through our creativity and that, we can do more of it.
Yes, this is going to require a grassroots effort. I know in the 3rd district, the lowest turnout is between Woodland to Prospect, Linwood, over to 39th Street. And so this is going to require a grassroots response. This is going to require churches. This is going to require our librarians. This is going to require us to be at the grocery store. Like Mayor Lucas stated, we find all kinds of ways to get the vote out, but then when it comes to getting the census out, we fall short. And it does require local electeds and everyone to do whatever we can to make sure people are counted through the census. And so this is going to require a grassroots effort. The 3rd district, we came in at 73% last census in 2010. We need to increase that at least by 5%. And so we're getting that word out to our neighborhood leaders and ensuring that, sometimes we might need to do a robocall to say, here's the link to just go ahead. It takes 10 minutes to get it done, but by any means necessary, we have to make this happen.
So I'll jump in here, Gwen, if you don't mind, and try to make use of the 5 minutes that people said we could go over. There are 2 questions in the queue that I'd like to direct to Mayor Quinton and to Commissioner Starks. The first is building on the status of broadband and whether or not the treatment of broadband as a utility could, and somewhat as suggested by Congressman Clyburn, that if we're going to get ubiquity, we've got to almost do what we did in the 20th century, and that is to use utility type regulation to get it out there. And then secondly, for the mayor, Google Fiber has been mentioned here on the Zoom a number of times. What are the lessons that we learned in Kansas City about the outreach to get Google Fiber to come? Now that they're there, we still seem to have a connectivity lag. And were there any lessons that you've learned or the city has learned from that episode that could help inform reaching 100% connectivity. We'll start with the commissioner first, if you don't mind.
Let me unmute. I was going to let my mayor go. To the question.
He's writing. I can see he's writing that in. That's going to take a while.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Obviously, when you're talking about, I do believe that more than anything, in the ethos of the question, which is that all Americans everywhere should have affordable, high quality broadband. And making it a utility in the sense of rate regulations and those types of things, I think is something that is a bridge too far. But when we're talking about municipal broadband and making sure that there are more levels and more ways that we can introduce competition, I think is certainly important. And one of the things that I have seen in particular that we focused on this year, and this was in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that was mentioned here earlier today, is working with a lot of the rural co-ops. You heard Whip Clyburn talk about the co-ops there and making sure that a lot of those folks are already touching a lot of homes, and making sure that we bring them into the conversation to broadband, I think is going to be extremely important.
Great, thank you. Mr. Mayor, lessons learned on Google Fiber?
Yeah, on Google Fiber, I think we saw just a world of public policy concerns. One is that when you get, and actually all of us who work in the equity space, and Ms. Grant's been doing it for years longer than I have. I know Councilwoman Robinson knows it, so many of us. It's how people get so excited and say, let's just do something now and we'll figure out the equity pieces later. You absolutely cannot do that. I think when we were rolling out Google Fiber, our then mayor, his colleague in Kansas City, Kansas, were saying this is going to be wonderful. We're going to expand to certain neighborhoods, but they didn't talk about how they would actually get Google Fiber signups in neighborhoods, how they would equitably make sure that the Google Fiber rollout was in every part of Kansas City. And so we, because I live in those neighborhoods too, became an afterthought. And the problem is, if you have somebody being an afterthought for 3 years, then it's real hard once the finances have changed, once they figured out everything under the sun, to just say, oh, we're going to fix it when we have a whole new model. And that fundamentally harmed the 3rd District when I was a councilman looking for opportunities to expand broadband accessibility. So I would say step 1, the equity piece needs to be a part of the conversation anytime, back to almost the utility point. We're talking about significant either incentives or partnership or giving away of public right-of-ways to allow for an entity like that to come into town. You from the jump say how it's helping our neighborhoods that frankly need that service the most.
Gwen, I'm going to turn it back to you to close this out and talk about any next steps. Thank you.
So there's a really great question in there for you, Commissioner Starks, and I'm just like, gosh, we need to ask that question. So I'm going to do it, and then we're going to close it out. And what is the FCC doing about the problems with the FCC data that ISPs provide regarding broadband coverage? Like, addressing it would be really greatly helpful with our planning efforts, because it's like if they have service out there and they say there's connectivity, when in fact it isn't, because people can't afford to subscribe to it. And so the data are not necessarily accurate. Are you all doing anything to address that, and how you require the data to be reported?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me say I have really enjoyed this panel. Thank you to everyone. I'm, of course, a commissioner, federal communications commissioner, and so I serve at the pleasure of all Americans. But I am so heartened to see what thoughtful, tremendous hard work is going, thoughtful energy there is back home for me in Kansas City, amongst all of you, all the panelists, and in particular, the mayor. To the question, we have a number of things. I've been deeply upset, most in particular, that we're talking about, in a lot of ways, folks getting gigabit speeds. Folks are out there getting gig speeds. And I have been so angry that there are so many Americans that are getting left behind. We have those who have much getting even more, while you have millions of Americans that are rural, that are urban, that are disconnected, getting left behind. And mapping is a critical piece of that. We have issues where, like we talked about, we won't get in the weeds here, but there's something that is basically sent to us by internet service providers called 477s, where somebody says, here's the area that I serve, but it turns out because of census tract data and a whole lot of issues, sometimes those aren't, we don't actually drill down into who has and who has not. And so we see this on the rural digital world, where I was upset with the lack of mapping and accurate mapping for us to be able to deploy real billions of dollars that flow from these decisions. And inaccurate mapping, I think, is a fatal flaw. We saw this on the 5G mobility fund that is going to be almost a $10 billion fund on who gets federal wireless paid for. The good news is that Congress made us do the right thing. They passed the Broadband Data Act late last year. And so a lot of our funding decisions now have to be done on accurate mapping. And so the good news is that, I have dissented a number of ways against my colleagues that don't see this the same way, but help is on the way and more accurate mapping is on the way.
Thank you so much for that. Thanks to all of our panelists for showing up today and bringing and sharing your knowledge with us and with Kansas City and hopefully the nation. We have so much more work ahead of us. We have a very active, robust collaboration here in Kansas City that includes all of the organizations I mentioned at the onset of this dialogue, and we will continue our work. We will press forward, and our goal is 100% connectivity, and there are a number of pathways to that end goal, and we are all united to get us there. So thank you again for joining us. Thanks to Congressman Clyburn for his powerful video message, and we look forward to the work ahead. Have a great day.
Thank you.